It is now time for the next part of tonight's program, where our panel of distinguished representatives of politics, academia, and the media are going to talk about Sir John A.'s legacy to Canada. And to moderate tonight's discussion, I'm delighted to say that we have the distinguished historian Patrice Dutil. Patrice is at the far end of the table. Patrice's most recent publication is called Macdonald at 200, New Reflections and Legacies, which just came out with Dundurn. It's a collection of essays he co-edited with Roger Hall. Patrice, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Merci, Brian. Merci de ce grand honneur que tu me fais de pouvoir présenter ce panel ce soir pour rendre hommage, pour discuter de John A. Macdonald. I have the very easy task and the great honor of introducing three admirable gentlemen that you all know very well already. At the far left, rather unexpectedly, I'm happy to introduce Chris Alexander. Chris Alexander. Chris Alexander has been the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration of the Government of Canada for 18 months now. He's the Member of Parliament for Ajax Pickering. He's been a Member of Parliament since 2011. Before embarking on a political career, Mr. Alexander worked for 18 years as a member of the Canadian Foreign Service. His first posting was at the Canadian Embassy in Russia, and in 2003, he was named Canada's first resident ambassador in Kabul, Afghanistan. Between 2005 and 2009, he served as Deputy Special Representative of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. Mr. Alexander has a degree from McGill University, a master's in politics, philosophy, and economics from Oxford University. In the middle, Andrew Coyne. Andrew is the editorials and comment editor for the National Post and the National Affairs columnist for the Postmedia News. He's a fellow at the School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Toronto. You all know Andrew. He's written previously for Maclean's Magazine, the National Post, the Globe and Mail, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, Saturday Night, the Walrus. Very frequently you see him on the CBC's The National. So tonight we're going to make this the at-issue panel on Sir John A. Andrew Coyne is a graduate of the University of Toronto and the London School of Economics. To my immediate left, Michael Bliss, who holds the elite rank of Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto. He's written numerous prize-winning books in Canadian politics, business history, and not least medical history, including The Discovery of Insulin, Banting, a biography, William Osler, and Harvey Cushing, A Life in Surgery. He's also written a surprisingly engaging autobiography, which I read with great pleasure. It says a great deal about Michael Bliss that his students published a festschrift in his honor. It's called Essays in Honor of Michael Bliss, Figuring the Social. So tonight what we're going to do is ask our three panelists some questions about their impressions of John A. on this 200th anniversary. And my first question would be this. If John A. had a smartphone in his hand, he'd probably be the most devastating Twitter around. He was a great master of the quip. Gentlemen, what is your favorite John A. Macdonald aphorism? And I'll start with you, Chris.
I think most of my favorite remarks from him are longer quotations, but on quip and aphorism, it would have to be that the people prefer Sir John A. drunk to George Brown sober, and it still applies today to the Globe and Mail.
Bravo. Andrew?
Well, I don't know if this counts as a quip, but it is a longer quote, but it is, I think, to me, quintessentially Macdonald. He said, "Whatever you do, adhere to the Union. We are a great country and shall become one of the greatest in the universe if we preserve it. We shall sink into insignificance and adversity if we suffer it to be broken." And there's two things that I find remarkable about that. One, of course, is just the soaring ambition, which was so typical of his time. Every time I walk by the Parliament buildings, it just strikes me what a remarkable thing, you know. after only a few years of building this country, that they, laying claim to half the continent and putting up this impressive structure. And of course, the other thing is that consciousness of what would be lost if we suffer it to be broken. And having spent most of my lifetime with people treating with quite a great degree of equanimity the prospect of the country breaking apart, I wish we had had a bit more of Macdonald's spirit in us as we approach that question.
Two quips, one in support of Andrew. Macdonald in the House of Commons: Sir, we are not 6 provinces, we are one great dominion. And the Macdonald that all politicians have to emulate, the advice to a young Conservative: when Dame Fortune empties her chamber pot on your head, you must smile and say, what a lovely spring shower we're having.
Thank you. Macdonald, above all, was highly successful as a politician. Long career before Confederation and, of course, after Confederation. He has a great deal to teach us about political success. What would be the lesson that you remember best? Chris?
I don't think there's a single lesson. I think in this man whose political career stretched from alderman briefly in 1843, elected to the Assembly of the United Province of Canada 1844, all the way to his death in 1891, there were many political qualities, and I would single out the following. First, a profound sense of inclusion and a passion for the diversity that was already there in Canada. Aboriginal friends, friends of many backgrounds, those of humble station, dukes and lords. He was comfortable in almost any company. Secondly, a passion for Canada's bicultural nature. No one claims he was fully bilingual, but he made these partnerships with Vigée, Taché, Cartier, and many others, and built the Bleu into a formidable wing of his party and believed that that was Canada's vocation. Nationalism, the idea that one could be a British subject and part of a great empire and a passionate Canadian, a citizen of a country that was emerging, and internationalism, an idea that we were a trading nation that needed to have a railway to be able to trade across the Pacific while trading in North America and with Europe, a passion for free enterprise, a bon ami in almost anything he did, even when the chamber pots rained down on him. I think he had a range of talents that reflected the realities of this country that very few have ever had, and very few have had the opportunity to have because of his longevity.
Well, Macdonald had many qualities, and Chris has listed several of them, but if I had to single out one or two, would be unscrupulousness and ruthlessness. And I don't say that as a negative thing. I think you would say the same thing of some of the great statesmen in history, Lincoln, Roosevelt, you go on. What sets those figures and Macdonald apart, of course, from your common garden variety politician, the present company accepted, of course, is that they were unscrupulous and ruthless in the pursuit of larger aims. They kept their eye on the prize of what they were trying to achieve. But unfortunately, I think in many respects, he became the template for future politicians of lesser stature and lesser ambition. And it's become, I think, a bit of a cliche, I think, in Canada that we're such a complicated country that you can only govern it by being as slippery as an eel, et cetera. I will grant that in Canadian politics, if you look through history, nice guys have tended to finish last. I mean, all my heroes are these, starchy Victorian liberals who Macdonald mowed down one after the other. But I think we're a little too obsessed with our own complexity. Lots of countries are as complicated or more complicated than we are. It's a lovely line from John Fowles, that narcissism consists in this, that when we grow too old to believe in our own uniqueness, we fall in love with our complexity. And I think there's a danger of that in this country. So I persist in the perhaps delusion that while some of the dark arts of politics will always be necessary for anybody who leads this country, that it doesn't have to be quite as bleak or as unprincipled as some of them have turned out to be.
That's a kind of liberal idealist critique of Macdonald that we've heard before. It is that Macdonald played on the worst in human nature, and it would be nice if we had politicians who played to the best in human nature, and that's a defensible position, Andrew. When I took a course labeled The History of Canadian Politics from the late Donald Creighton, the course turned out to be 23 weeks about Sir John A. Macdonald's political career.
Here. Bring that course back.
And 3 weeks at the end about Laurier's. And
it's about right.
And the reason for that is that Sir John A.'s career really does contain all of the Canadian issues. It's all there. Andrew, you used the word template. He sets a template for having to try to govern this country. You can also say that Macdonald writes the genetic code for being a Canadian politician. And virtually every politician since has reflected one or more strands of Macdonald's DNA, although they manage sometimes to get them tangled and confused. But the heart of it all is that for Macdonald and every Canadian politician since, the problem is to find the balance between trying to implement a vision of the country and trying to get by from day to day.
Yeah, agreed.
But thank you.
Can I register
a quick rebuttal?
Yeah, I mean, ruthless maybe in pursuit of a very concrete objective. Unscrupulous, no. Disraeli, all the people that knew him, those of humble station, up to the Disraelis and Lauriers, saw him as a gentleman, saw him as honorable. And
outside of politics, absolutely.
And he went down to defeat in 1873 and lost office in the vortex of a huge scandal. But he came back in 1878 to be prime minister for 13 years. And here's what he said at that time. Long after this quarrel is over, it will be recorded in the history of this Dominion of Canada that there was one body of men in this country willing to forget self, to forget party, to forget section, to build up a great interest and make a great country. And they will say that there was another party who did the opposite. And I say the history of the future will be our justification and their condemnation because, while there was a scandal, it was about an issue. It was about building a railway that he championed, that the opposition did not. And without it, I would argue, and without Sir John A., we would not have a Canada that extends to 3 oceans, that includes 10 provinces and 3 territories and 10 million square kilometers. And that's why he's indispensable. And that's why ultimately he's honorable.
Okay.
Just one last thing.
That was one rebuttal. A second, right of rebuttal.
Not to disagree with even one word of that. I just wanted to add an anecdote. If we're talking about inheritors of Macdonald, I think one of them would be Jean Chrétien. In this particular respect, of course, we know that Macdonald was known as Old Tomorrow, and there's great wisdom in that. You don't have to don't make decisions until you absolutely have to. And Chrétien was the master of that. Somebody once asked Chrétien who his favorite hockey player was, and he said without hesitation, Jacques Plante, the great Montreal Canadiens goalie. And they asked him why. And he said, because he never made the first move. And if you want the Chrétien modus operandi in a nutshell, just have that image of the forward skating in on the goalie, and the goalie waits him out and waits him out and waits him out.
One last round on the political lessons of John A. Macdonald.
The other aphorism that we often use, Macdonald talked about how he always played the long game, and that covers Chrétien and covers so much more. And of course, Chris gave the ringing justification for a lot of what Macdonald did, and it's hard to disagree with, although historians say, well, you're begging a lot of questions about what the opposition would have
Yes.
would have done. But and I would go on to say, though, that the other side of Macdonald, I mean, he was a remarkably far-sighted but also reckless politician. The Pacific scandal was a pretty serious scandal, and if the country had ever learned what he did with the CPR after the Pacific scandal, the way he made it a political railroad, contributing vast sums to the Conservative Party, if they had ever found out the second chapter, it would have destroyed his career. So he was right on the margin, I think. But you succeed, and a lot of things get forgotten.
Yeah.
Let's talk
they didn't have the Accountability Act.
Now that you've heaped so much praise on Sir John A., I wonder if you're just as forgiving about other aspects of his life that we all know about and are worth discussing, even on his 200th birthday. His failings with alcohol, his views of minorities, his treatment of prairie Indians. What do you think of this 130-odd years later? Chris.
Well, the alcohol was a serious issue. I think given the stress he was under, given the personal, the situation of his family, the personal misfortune he endured, and given the times, the quantities of Goodham and Wirtz product that were consumed in Toronto, Kingston, and elsewhere, it's not that exceptional. He had an amazing constitution. He bounced back. He died with his boots on in political office, still highly respected. On Aboriginal Canadians, let's be clear, he gave them the vote. Laurier took it away. It was never fully extended again, and in Macdonald's time it was never universal suffrage for Aboriginal people. It was just for those who met the same property requirement as other electors at that time, but until John George Diefenbaker. So I think there's a sympathy, a familiarity with Aboriginal people with Macdonald in Macdonald's time that is exceptional, and there's a treaty record that is quite substantial too. In the early 20th century, we did much worse, from the 20s on till about a decade ago when it resumed. On racism, I think the record on immigration speaks otherwise. The Family Compact and the leaders that came before him really did promote only British immigration. Macdonald diversified that, and by building the railway and by having his national policy, he needed more people than the British Isles could provide, and he got many more from Europe and from some other places, not on the scale of just before the First World War, Ukrainian, Austro-Hungarian, etc., but he started us on that path. And I just don't see racism. This is a guy who, on the stump, on an election in Toronto, hears that the first black postman in the city has been basically locked out by his co-workers, has a word with his people, and the guy's welcomed back on the job a couple of days later. That is exceptional. That is an exceptional step for someone to take who probably didn't need those votes for the election, but thought it was important because that's the way Canada is, even in his time.
There's a danger with all these issues of I believe it's called presentism, all these issues can be viewed from the vantage point of the person at the time or from the vantage point of the present. And some things that might have been excused or looked benignly on at the time, we now look upon with great severity. And some things that would have been looked upon with great severity at the time, we now consign to rather less importance. For an example of the latter, the Pacific scandal. It was obviously an enormous scandal, drove him from office, but when we're writing the biography of Macdonald today, it is not the first paragraph. It is somewhere down below his achievements, and rightly so. Mind you, if I'd been alive at the time, I would have insisted upon driving him from office. So there are different criteria that you apply at different points in time. Conversely, many of the things that we would now judge him to varying degrees harshly on, his attitudes towards Aboriginals, his attitudes towards immigrants of various races. They are not atypical of his time, and in fact, in many respects, he was ahead of his time in some of these issues. So I do think we have to be careful not to apply a screen to these things of attitudes and mores that were not prevalent at the time. We judge people's, in moral terms, relative to the signals that they're getting around them. If everyone around you is saying X or Y, let's say in a positive way, if everyone around you is sending the signal that racism is a terrible affront to human dignity, and you persist in being a racist, you can be judged in very harsh terms. If no one around you is sending that signal, or if in fact you live in times that are deeply steeped in racism, it's rather hard to judge that individual. You can judge the racism, of course, but the individual, I think, must be more benignly viewed upon.
No disagreement here. When you think that the House of Commons had an open bar well into the 1890s, you can imagine Macdonald wasn't alone in using it. The particular racial issue that some historians are making a lot about is that Macdonald's support for effectively excluding Chinese immigration. And the issue there is that everybody wanted to exclude Chinese immigration. If Macdonald was a racist, so was virtually everybody else, including Laurier, including J.S. Woodsworth. This was an age of hard racial attitudes that have since changed. With Indian policy, again, there was an awful tragedy going on the Canadian prairies, and Sir John A. was also Minister of Indian Affairs. And at times, he withheld rations from hungry tribes to try to force them onto their reserves. The reason for that is that their food supply had collapsed, a way of life had collapsed with the end of the buffalo. The only hope was that Indians would go on to the reserves and that maybe agriculture would work. The single greatest threat, perhaps, to the Dominion of Canada in the late 19th century would have come if the Plains Indians had asked the United States to come to their aid. And that's the last thing the Canadian Indians would do, because Canada was seen as a country where Indians were treated much better than in the United States. And the other achievement of Sir John A.'s that he doesn't get enough credit for is the founding of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police in 1873 to protect the natives of the plains from whiskey traders and others from the south.
Thank you. We're going to wrap this up with one more pregnant question. Has John A.'s vision of Canada been realized? Go ahead, Chris.
Well,
or what's missing?
I'm not sure. He looked as far ahead as he could. Did he see 2015? Probably not the internet, probably not terrorism in the terms we see it today, probably not the global economy the way we have it, but in a sense, it has been realized. And what was his dream? It was the dream of one country under a crown, a kingdom of Canada, as Tupper and he would have had it if there hadn't been constitutional debates about a second kingdom of that time, independent of the United States, connected to Europe and Asia by trade, and living out a quality of freedom and a quality of economic life that few could match. And I think we are doing that today, true to his vision. That parliament is the parliament that he sat in. This capital is the capital that he was part of choosing. These languages are the languages that he wanted to be ours, officially, nationally. Immigration, trade, diversity in the sense we were discussing earlier, a link to those deeper sources of freedom, right back to Magna Carta, as Brian was saying, is still here, as well as to French traditions of cultural and political achievement, still very much at the foundation of what Canada is. So I think we did it. And I think what we have to remember is how contingent it was. I mean, the Pacific scandal was a great scandal. Inappropriate things done by Macdonald, especially by Sir Hugh Allen, but it wouldn't have become the firestorm it was if there hadn't been jilted American capitalists who wanted that railroad and who never wanted Canadians and their British backers to have a system that was independent of the Union Pacific and never wanted that national vision, political vision, stretching across the country, including provinces from Manitoba westward, to be completed, and Sir John A. Macdonald completed it with a little help from his friends.
Well, in the most essential source, of course, his vision was realizing that the country is here and has risen to a position of greatness in the world, if not in the universe, which I do love that phrase. You know, and I think that's a tribute in great respect to the founders, that they, as the phrase has it, they built better than they knew, even with some deficiencies. I think the country has great reasons to hold together. I do not subscribe to the great statesman theory of confederation that can only be held together by the heroic acts of statesmanship. I think there's great underlying strengths that account for our being together. But in another sense, of course, it has not been realized, which is that his vision of the country and the vision of many of the founders was of a strong national government capable of exercising the powers that a national government must have. They went, and he went further than I would have gone. I mean, I like to think of myself as a classical federalist with appropriate powers to each of the federal and the provincial levels, whereas Macdonald's vision of federalism was much more center-heavy. But that was whittled away very shortly thereafter, particularly by decisions of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council and by subsequent events, so that we are still here 150 years later. I know this will be an issue dear to Brian Crowley's heart, without a proper economic union, when that was one of the raison d'etres of Confederation to begin with. And in many respects, we have allowed that aspect of the proper federal authorities in things that are properly federal have not been allowed to reach their full legitimacy, their full flower. You have to bear in mind, the only reason to have a federation is to have a federal government. If all we wanted to do was to get along together, and we could be 10 separate countries and send ambassadors back and forth, and we'd get along swell, but we wouldn't be what Sir John A. wanted us to be. I think that ties in with questions about democratic legitimacy and democratic reform at the center, that if we had a more effective parliamentary form of government, the form that we're supposed to have but that's been allowed to dwindle, I think perhaps we'd be more willing to assign the federal government those powers that are rightfully its, that we wouldn't see it as being that government, their government, that other government somewhere far away, but we would see it more as our government. And I think perhaps that's the final step in realizing the greatness of Macdonald's vision.
A country is always going to be a work in progress. The issue with Macdonald is the same that the Americans have with Washington and Lincoln. Without great statesmen like that, you might not have a country to then tinker with. And then to talk about one small victory, when we were talking about Macdonald's blind spots, it was also the case in 1885 that Macdonald tried to give the vote to women. And this is now acknowledged as one of his most remarkable pieces of foresight. Largely thanks to Patrice, we had a lovely dinner in Toronto to honor Macdonald's birthday, not as splendid a setting as this. But the two key speakers at that dinner were Kim Campbell, Canada's first female prime minister, and Premier Wynne of Ontario. And they both talked about Macdonald and women and how that's come to fruition. And that was very moving. And I think it was also moving that we heard Laurier's eulogy on the death of Macdonald, as we heard a bit tonight, but also that it was a Liberal Premier of Ontario who talked about what Macdonald meant, and to her, a politician who brought people together for the betterment of the country. And it does seem to me that over time, we're going to, I hope, see how Macdonald transcends partisanship. You don't know what party George Washington represented. You know him as the father of the country. And I think we're going to see that increasingly of Macdonald.
Thank you, thank you. I'll just close by saying that Macdonald is eminently discussable, that Macdonald is well worth a discussion at the table, at the dinner table, whenever we consider politics and policy. There are profound lessons that can be learned from studying Sir John A. and discovering more about him. There is a literature now on him, on his works. It is hopefully developing and blossoming, and I invite you all to explore that literature in the next century, since we've got time. On behalf of everybody here, Chris, Andrew, Michael, thank you very much.